They never told you this part of Viking history. You've heard of the raids, the burning churches, the shattered kingdoms, but not what happened inside the sacred temples after the axes fell. When virgins sworn to the gods were captured, their fates were not written in chronicles. They were whispered in fear, covered in silence, erased by priests. Tonight, we uncover that forbidden truth, and once you hear it, you'll never look at the Vikings the same way again. The sky was red that evening, not with the glow of sunset, but with the light of fire. It rose from the wooden beams of a temple deep in the Saxon lands, sparks flying upward like souls torn from the earth. The Vikings had come. Their longships had cut through the rivers like blades, their oars thrumming in unison, their dragon prows gleaming with menace. And now they stood inside a place that was never meant to be violated. A temple, a sanctuary, the last refuge of the gods. The chronicles of monks describe the fall of these temples in one voice: destruction. But they do not speak of the women within, priestesses, maidens bound by oath, their bodies promised to their gods, their voices sworn to chants and prayers. Virgins, some called them, pure, untouched, symbols of the sacred. To the people, they were living offerings, guardians of bridges between the divine and mortal worlds. But to the Vikings, they were something else entirely: prizes, power, and sometimes sacrifices. Picture it: the smoke curling above the temple roof, the carved idols splintering under axe strikes. Amid the chaos, women are pulled from shadowed alcoves. Some scream, some remain silent, faces painted with ash, eyes closed, as if waiting for fate to fall. These were no ordinary captives. Taking them was more than plunder, it was desecration. And here lies the first shocking truth. In many accounts, the Vikings spared no sanctity. Temples that once rang with chants of the old gods, whether in Saxon lands, in Frisia, or even in their own Scandinavian groves, became sites of blood and terror. The women within them were either dragged into captivity, bound to warriors as symbols of conquest, or subjected to rituals too dark for scribes to detail. But the silence of the chronicles tells its own story. Why omit their fates, unless the truth was too disturbing to record? Unless the rituals practiced upon these maidens were not just acts of war, but echoes of something older, something sacred, something the Vikings themselves believed gave them power. Now imagine standing there, a Viking jarl, his axe dripping, staring at the trembling maiden before him. To kill her outright would be easy. To claim her as concubine, expected. But what if she carried value beyond flesh? What if the temple's virgins were believed to be bound to the gods, their purity, a vessel of divine favor? To take them was not merely conquest. It was to seize the very will of the divine. In the Annals of Fulda, a chilling detail emerges. After one Viking raid, sacred women vanished entirely, their names never recorded again. Were they absorbed into Viking households? Were they sacrificed in the blood-soaked rites of Odin, hung in groves, or drowned in bogs as offerings? The silence forces us to imagine the unthinkable. Would you, if you stood in that temple, have fought to the last breath? Or would you have closed your eyes, whispering prayers to gods who would not answer? The motif of silence recurs here. Silence in the chronicles. Silence in the halls where these women once chanted. Silence in their names, forgotten. Yet silence itself becomes a voice. It tells us that something happened too profound, too dark, to be spoken. And here's the twist. Not all temple maidens remained victims. Some, like the priestesses of Uppsala, were rumored to wield strange powers. When captured, they whispered curses, called storms, or swore vengeance that followed their captors for years. The sagas, written later, describe Viking warriors struck down by sudden illness after seizing sacred women. Coincidence, or the power of fear and belief shaping fate itself? Picture the aftermath of one such raid. The temple lies in ruin, idols shattered, blood on the floor. A handful of maidens are marched toward the longships, veils torn, hands bound. Villagers watch in silence, their gods humiliated, their hope gone. But in the hearts of the people, the story does not end. They whisper that the virgins carry vengeance with them, that they will haunt the Vikings, that the gods will punish. Stories like these spread faster than fire, turning terror into legend. Now pause again. If you were there, one of those villagers, watching your sacred women vanish into the nightwood, you have believed they were doomed. Or would you have believed they would return, transformed, to destroy their captors from within? The first chapter closes here, in the smoke of a burning temple, the cries of maidens echoing into the night. Their fates remain shrouded, their silence louder than any chronicler's words. But this silence is only the beginning, for in the next chapter, we follow them beyond the halls of their gods, into the long ships of their captors, where captivity turned into a stage for betrayal, ambition, and the most forbidden rituals of the Viking Age. The longship cut through the black waters like a blade. Its dragon-head prow rose and fell with the waves, its open deck heavy with warriors drunk on victory. Behind them, the temple was ash and ruin. Before them stretched the endless sea, carrying not only gold and silver, but the most sacred of captives, the temple virgins. The chronicles are silent about this journey, but silence itself is telling, because in that silence something must have happened that could not be written. Imagine the maidens bound together near the mast, their veils torn away, the moonlight shining on their pale faces. Around them, warriors feasted on mead, laughing, chanting, beating their shields in rhythm. The clash of iron against wood sounded like a heartbeat, echoing across the waves. To the Vikings, the sea was not just water, it was a living being, a force to be appeased. Sacrifices were often made to ensure safe passage. Animals, slaves, sometimes even humans. So here is the chilling question: what value did the temple virgins carry on this voyage? Were they seen as prizes for the warriors' beds, or as offerings to the gods of wind and wave? Consider the Norse sagas. In the Ynglinga saga, sacrifices to Odin included kings, maidens, and warriors, alike hung from trees, throats cut or drowned in marshes. On long voyages, captives were sometimes thrown into the sea, their blood mixing with salt water, their deaths believed to calm storms. If temple virgins were bound to the gods, their lives may have carried even greater weight as offerings. Picture a storm breaking suddenly over the ship. The sea turns blacker, waves rise like mountains, lightning splits the sky. The warriors, once triumphant, grow fearful. They believe the gods are angry. The Jarl looks at the bound women. His eyes are hard, his voice like stone. one must be given. The crew seizes a maiden, her scream drowned by the roar of thunder. They lift her, struggling, toward the edge, and then silence as she vanishes into the sea. Moments later, the storm begins to ease. Coincidence or belief made flesh. But not all captives were slain. Some were kept alive, their value not in death, but in the fear and awe they inspired. Warriors believed that binding a maiden of the temple to one's household could bring fortune, fertility, and favor from the gods. In this way, captivity became ritual possession. Imagine being carried not as a woman, but as a living talisman. Your silence turned into an omen. Would you have chosen the sea, a quick end in the storm, or survival knowing survival meant being turned into something unrecognizable, no longer human, but symbol? Among the warriors, whispers grew. Some believed the virgins cursed them, their silence carrying the weight of the gods. A warrior who laid with one might fall ill, another might drown. Whether by chance or curse, deaths on voyages were often linked to the captives. The priestesses had no swords, but their greatest weapon was the belief that they were dangerous. And belief in the Viking world was as sharp as any blade. One saga fragment, little known, tells of a maiden carried across the sea who spoke no word, ate no food, and stared at the horizon for days. When the ship reached land, every man who had touched her died within the year. Was it poison? Was it chance? Or was it her silence, heavy as iron, that killed them? Now imagine being one of those men. Would you have dared to touch her? The voyage was not only physical, it was spiritual. The sea was a liminal space, a passage between worlds. For the maidens, it was a journey from sanctity into shadow. Every wave carried them farther from the gods they had served, closer to the unknown. And yet, within their silence, they carried something with them: defiance, vengeance, perhaps even secrets of rituals older than the Vikings themselves. The chapter closes with the image of the longship sliding into a foreign harbor, its dragon head gleaming, its oars pulling slowly. The warriors cheer as they see new land, but behind them, bound at the mast, the maiden's eyes do not cheer. They are fixed on something deeper, darker, waiting to unfold. Their silence has not broken, and silence, as we will see, can be more dangerous than steel. The longships slid into the fjord like shadows. Mist clung to the water, softening the jagged cliffs that towered above. At the harbor's edge, smoke curled from longhouses, the smell of pine, peat, and fish drifting over the waves. Villagers gathered to watch the returning warriors. Children ran along the shore, pointing at the dragon prows. Old women raised their hands to the gods, muttering prayers. The warriors cheered. They had returned with silver, with slaves, with glory. But hidden among the loot was something darker: the bound figures of temple maidens. The captives were dragged ashore, their white robes stained with seawater and blood, their faces pale as bone. They did not cry out. They did not resist. Their silence unnerved even the villagers, who whispered to one another, were these not sacred women? Did the gods not guard them? To bring them here was dangerous. To keep them here, perhaps even worse. The warriors, drunk on triumph, paraded the maidens through the settlement. Torches flared, dogs barked. Children watched with wide eyes, and somewhere in the shadows, the seeress of the village, the vulva, stepped forward. Her staff was tipped with bronze, her cloak trimmed with fur, her eyes sharp with the weight of prophecy. She looked upon the virgins and spoke a single line: "They belong not to men, but to gods." The words sent a chill through the crowd, because in Viking culture, to belong to the gods was to be destined for sacrifice. Here lies the forbidden truth. Many captives, especially those deemed sacred, were given to Odin, Thor, or Frey in rituals that blurred the line between devotion and horror. At Uppsala, according to Adam of Bremen in the 11th century, sacrifices were made every 9 years. Men, women, and animals hung from the sacred grove, their bodies left swaying among the branches. Could temple maidens, captured from foreign lands, have met such a fate? Imagine the night of such a sacrifice. A great hall filled with warriors, the air thick with mead and smoke. The maidens stand at the center, their hands bound with leather thongs, their eyes reflecting the firelight. The Gothi, the priest, raises his voice in chant, calling on Odin. The crowd beats their shields, the sound a thunder that shakes the rafters. And then the maidens are led outside, to the grove, to the great tree where ropes already hang. Would you have begged for mercy, or stood silent, as some did, accepting fate as a final prayer? But not all fates were death. Some maidens were absorbed into the households of their captors. To be a concubine was captivity, yes, but it was also survival. And survival sometimes became power. One tale, half hidden in the sagas, speaks of a priestess who bore a son to a Viking chieftain. That son, raised in the hall, grew to be a leader whose descendants carried both Norse and sacred blood. Was this vengeance, or victory of a different kind? Betrayal lurks here too. Not every Viking welcomed the idea of keeping such women alive. Some feared them, whispering that their silence hid curses. A warrior might wake in the night, gasping, swearing he saw a maiden standing over his bed, her eyes glowing like embers. Another might fall ill after touching one. These were stories born of guilt, fear, and superstition, but belief made them real. And here lies another twist. Sometimes the maidens themselves became participants in ritual, not victims, but instruments. Some sources hint that captured priestesses were forced to chant in ceremonies, their voices lending weight to Viking rites. Imagine the bitter irony: once sworn to their gods, now compelled to sing praises to Odin, Thor, or Frey. Their words, once sacred, twisted into tools of the enemy. The chapter builds toward a single, unforgettable night. A hall at the edge of the fjord, filled with drunken laughter. The warriors boast of victories. The maidens sit in shadow, veiled, silent. Suddenly, the vulva rises, her voice cutting through the din. Blood must be given. The hall falls silent. All eyes turn to the captives. The decision is made. Some will live, some will die, and their fates will shape the destiny of the hall itself. The torches sputter. The sea roars outside. The maidens do not weep. Their silence is their last weapon, and it terrifies all who hear it. What would you have done if you were there in that hall, watching the line between devotion and horror blur before your eyes? The chapter closes with the image of the sacred grove, the ropes swaying gently in the wind, as if waiting. The maiden's fate is sealed, but in sealing it, the Vikings may have bound themselves to something darker than even they understood. The fjord was still, but inside the hall, the air trembled with fear. The feast had ended, the torches guttered low, and the warriors lay in drunken slumber. Only the maidens remained awake, their bound hands folded in their laps, their eyes reflecting the dying fire. Silence had been their weapon, but now silence began to crack. It began with whispers, not in the language of their captors, but in the tongue of their gods. A chant, low and steady, weaving through the rafters like smoke. At first, the guards thought it was the wind, but the sound grew, voices overlapping, rising in rhythm, until the hall seemed alive with a hymn not meant for Viking ears. The Volva, the seeress of the settlement, heard it too. She entered the hall and froze, her staff trembling in her hands. The chants were foreign, yes, but they carried power. To her ears, it was a summons, a call to something beyond flesh and blood. She saw the warriors twitch in their sleep, their faces pale, their breaths short, as if caught in a dream they could not escape. The maidens' whispers had reached the realm of the gods. This is the forbidden truth. Prophecy was not the sole domain of Viking seeresses. Every culture had its sacred women, bound to temples, trained in ritual. When those worlds collided, captured virgins of temples met the seeresses of the north. The result was not silence. It was chaos. Two spiritual traditions clashing in a hall of fire and fear. The villagers whispered that one of the maidens could see the future. She was young, with eyes like storm clouds, her hair black as ravens' wings. When questioned, she spoke in riddles. The sea will rise, she said. Blood will run before the harvest, and when storms did strike, when warriors drowned in the fjord, her words were remembered. Fear clung to her name like frost. Would you have believed her or dismissed her as madness born of grief? But prophecy, once loosed, is a weapon that cuts both ways. The Vova, jealous and threatened, declared that the maidens must be tested. On a night of blood moon, she led them into the grove. Warriors gathered, drums beating, the smell of pine and fire heavy in the air. The maidens were forced to stand before the sacred tree, their eyes raised to the sky. The Volva called on Odin, demanding the truth. Were these women cursed or chosen? In that silence, something broke. A raven landed on the branch above them, cawing once, then twice. The crowd gasped. To the Norse, ravens were Odin's messengers, bringers of fate. The meaning was clear. These women were not to be dismissed. They had been marked. From that night on, the captives were no longer seen as mere spoils. They were feared. Some warriors claimed to hear their voices in dreams, calling them to the sea. Others swore that when the maidens stared, the milk in cows soured. The fish nets came up empty. Children fell ill. Were these curses relore, the weight of superstition twisting every misfortune into proof? And then came vengeance. A warrior who had mocked one of the maidens was found dead outside the hall, his body pale, his eyes wide with terror, no wound upon him. The villagers whispered that she had cursed him. Another fell from a cliff, another drowned in calm waters. Coincidence? Or the slow revenge of women who had nothing left but silence and the fear it carried? Here lies the twist. Sometimes silence is louder than screams. Their refusal to cry, to beg, to yield became a mirror. Warriors projected their own guilt upon them until it devoured them from within. Would you, if you had been one of those maidens, chosen to break your silence and beg for life? Or would you have held it, turning silence itself into a blade sharper than steel. The chapter builds toward its climax on a night when the hall was struck by lightning. Fire roared through the rafters, warriors scrambled in panic, and amid the chaos, the maidens stood together, their eyes fixed on the flames. Some claimed to see them smile. The blaze consumed the hall, but the women were untouched, carried out by villagers who now believed they were bound to fate. By dawn, the hall was ash. The seeress declared that the gods had chosen the captives as instruments of destiny. They would live but to live as tools of prophecy, feared and revered, no longer human, but symbols of the gods' wrath. The silence of the chronicles hides this transformation, but the sagas remember fragments. Women who came from foreign lands, who spoke in riddles, who cursed kings and haunted dreams. Their names are gone, but their shadow lingers. The chapter closes with the image of the burned hall, smoke curling into the morning sky, the maidens standing at its edge. Their eyes hold not despair, but something darker, knowledge that silence, prophecy, and vengeance had given them power greater than any crown. The fjord lay quiet under a pale dawn. Smoke from the burned hall still lingered, curling into the sky like the memory of screams. The maidens had survived the fire, but survival was not freedom. To live as symbols of prophecy was a chain as heavy as iron, and in the weeks that followed, those chains began to tighten. The warriors grew restless. To keep sacred captives was dangerous. Their presence had already brought lightning, fire, and fear. Some argued they should be sacrificed outright, offered to Odin to cleanse the hall of misfortune. Others whispered that to kill them would invite even greater wrath. The village was divided, and when a people are divided, betrayal always comes one night. As the wind howled down the fjord, the Volva summoned the leaders of the settlement. She told them the maidens were cursed, that their survival would bring ruin to the clan. Her staff struck the ground. Her eyes burned with fire. "Exile them," she commanded. "Send them away before their silence kills us all." And so betrayal came cloaked as mercy. The maidens were led to the shore, not with ropes, but with false kindness. A small ship was prepared, its hull stocked with meager supplies: barley, salted fish, water casks. Warriors pushed it into the tide. The captives were forced aboard. The villagers stood watching, their faces masks of fear and relief. Some spat, others prayed. The ship drifted into the mist, carrying the forgotten daughters of temples into exile. Would you, in their place, have wept at the betrayal? Or would you have seen it as the first taste of freedom? Exile was not always an end. Sometimes it was a beginning. Across the seas, fragments of saga and rumor tell of women who arrived in distant lands, stripped of all they were, and yet carved out legacies that endured. One tale speaks of a maiden who reached the Orkneys, where she became the seeress of a new clan, feared for her visions of storms and deaths. Another whispers of a woman who reached Ireland, where she bore a son who grew into a warlord, his bloodline blending Norse and native kingship. Exile turned victims into founders, ghosts into legends. Imagine their ship drifting through fog, the sea endless, the horizon blurred. Days passed. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, despair pressed down. But in their silence, they still carried power. At night, they chanted softly, words carried on the wind. The warriors had feared their voices, but on the sea, their voices gave them strength. Each chant was a thread, binding them not to captors, but to each other. And then jagged cliffs rose before them, black against the sky, a beach of stone, waves crashing hard. They beached the ship, stumbling ashore. There, in that desolate place, exile became survival. They built fire from driftwood, gathered shellfish, hunted birds. Step by step, they turned from captives into wanderers, from wanderers into leaders. Would you, cast adrift on strange shores, have clung to the past, or embraced the wild land as your own? Betrayal had cast them out, but betrayal also freed them. No longer bound to Viking halls, they carved their own fate, and with them they carried fragments of their temples, chants, symbols, prophecies. In new lands, they became the keepers of forbidden knowledge, whispering secrets to those who would listen. Yet betrayal left scars. Some never found land. Some perished at sea, their ships swallowed by storms, their bodies claimed by the deep. The sagas do not name them, but in the silence of waves, in the crash of storms, their memory lingers. The chapter ends on a haunting image, a lone woman standing on a rocky shore, her hair whipping in the wind, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind her lies exile. Before her lies destiny. She is no longer a captive, no longer a sacrifice. She is something new, an exile turned into a founder, her silence transformed into survival. The wind moves differently at the edge of history. It whispers, carrying fragments of voices long forgotten. And in that whisper, if you listen closely, you can hear them still, the defeated virgins of temples, erased from chronicles, erased from names, but not erased from memory. The chronicles are careful. They speak of raids, of plunder, of burning halls and shattered kingdoms. They speak of kings and jarls, of battles won and lost. But when it comes to the women dragged from sacred temples, they fall silent. Their erasure is deliberate, for to tell their story would be to admit something dangerous, that captivity did not always mean death, that silence could outlast swords, and that these women shaped the destinies of the very men who claimed them. Think of the lineages that rose in the centuries after the Viking Age. Normandy, carved out by Rollo, gave us William the Conqueror, yet even William's bloodline carried whispers of foreign brides, women taken and transformed into queens. The Orkneys tell of families with Cirruses at their root, women who came not as conquerors but as captives. Iceland, founded by exiles, holds sagas filled with hints of sacred women who crossed the seas and built new lives on its black soil. Coincidence? Or the echoes of forgotten priestesses who turned exile into legacy? Imagine one such woman. She bears no name we know, but her children grow strong. Her grandchildren rule farms. Her descendants carve sagas into parchment. Her silence has become bloodline, woven into the very fabric of nations. Though her temple burned, though her gods fell silent, she still speaks in the veins of kings, in the myths of poets, in the stories we whisper now. But why were their names erased? Because memory is power. To name them would be to honor them, to admit that women taken as captives had shaped dynasties, cursed kingdoms, and haunted halls. To name them would be to show that prophecy and silence can be more enduring than conquest. And so they were buried, their names left unrecorded, their fates left blank, their stories silenced. Yet silence does not mean absence. Silence can echo louder than words. Would you, if you lived in that age, have written their names in the chronicles, knowing it would defy kings and priests? Or would you have obeyed, leaving them in shadows where their power could not threaten the order of men? The legacy of these forgotten women matters because it reminds us that history is not just what was written, but what was hidden. Every burning temple, every captured maiden, every ship cast into exile adds to a story that still shapes us. Their suffering built dynasties. Their silence haunted kings. Their erasure warns us of how easily power chooses what we remember and what we forget. And here lies the final forbidden truth. When you speak of Viking kings, of jarls, of sagas, you are also speaking of them. For in every crown forged from conquest, there runs the blood of women stolen from sanctity. In every dynasty that rose, there echoes their silence. Their names may be lost, but their legacy is immortal. The hall is dark now. The fires of the Viking age are ash. But on the wind, the whispers remain. Whispers of priestesses turned captives. Captives turned exiles. Exiles turned founders. Their story is not gone. It is waiting for us to listen.